Genesis 16 is where we're going to be. Genesis 16. And just for information, we're going to take a couple of more weeks here and going to try and wind down the life of Abraham in a couple of large bites. And then I think the last Sunday of the month I think it will be the last Sunday of the month, I have a couple of more questions that I want to field, and then the 1st of April we're going to turn our attention to a completely new subject. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and pray, and we will look at our passage this morning. Lord, thank you for your unwavering faithfulness, for your commitment to the fulfillment of your word, regardless of what covenant people do, and of your skill, wisdom, and mercy in bringing it to pass. And I pray then your blessing upon our time together in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, we'll read through the Genesis 16 in just a little bit. It is the story that recounts to us the birth of Ishmael and how he came into this world. And the consequences of the birth of Ishmael have some of the most far-reaching and visible. I turned it on. I turned my mic on. I just didn't. Is that better? Let there be sound. So anyway, Genesis 16, the birth of Ishmael, we'll look at the text. Some of the most visible and far-reaching consequences of poor human decision-making. And yet, even this, folks, we cannot escape the providence of God in bringing Ishmael into this world. So to me, there's I don't want to say a dilemma. The Bible doesn't explore all of that. But we would have to have somebody like Ishmael if there wasn't Ishmael. There just would have to be. But Ishmael is the man that God used, and we will look at the way that he is using him at the end of the passage. God had made a covenant with Abraham, a commitment to him. The Abrahamic covenant. It is a covenant that involves land and seed and blessing and cursing. And in Genesis chapter 13, shortly after Abraham entered into this covenant with God, and God entered into the covenant with him, the land portion of the promise is threatened by famine in the land. And Abraham responds to that by going to Egypt, and then he soon backtracks to the place where he should have been. And in Genesis 16, at least in the minds of Abraham and Sarah, the seed portion of the promise are in jeopardy. And of course, we know from Genesis 11, before we ever get to the covenant, so that we are aware that God is aware, Sarah cannot have children. And so that is a motivator to the Lord, but it is a detraction to Abraham and Sarah. And so, at this point in time in the text, right, Abraham and Sarah concoct a scenario to take matters into their own hands because they believe the promise. It is because they believe the promise that they do this. And that becomes part of the devastating dimension to it. So Genesis 16 really falls along two lines. We will look at the first 6 verses at the beginning in chapter 16, verses 1 through 6, describe for us the folly of man. Here are the foolish decisions of both Abraham and Sarah. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children. And she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid. It may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. And he went in unto Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. Sarai said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarai, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And when Sarai dwelt hardly with her, she fled from her face. So the first 6 verses then are the folly of man. Abram and Sarah have been in the land about 10 years. That's what we're told in verse number 3. This means Sarah is about 77 years of age. In chapter 17 and verse 17, we will be told that she is 90, and there are 13 years between chapter 17 and chapter 16. So if we do the 90, take away 13, we have a 77-year-old woman. And even though, folks, people lived a long time in those days, Abram lived to 175, they lived the vast majority of those years as adults, or what we might call senior citizens. In other words, for Abram, middle age is not 80. Sarah is 77, and she's a 77-year-old woman with the body of a 77-year-old woman and the reproductive abilities of a 77-year-old woman. She has no child, but she does have, we are told, this Egyptian handmaid. Almost certainly, this is something that she had received from her time in Egypt. When she was down there and Pharaoh had brought Sarah into his household with the intentions of adding her to his harem, and Pharaoh enriched Abraham because of this, no doubt, or it seems that there's little doubt, that one of the things that Sarah received was this Egyptian handmaid. And Sarah then suggests that since she cannot have children, Hagar should be the surrogate. And it is at this point in the narrative, folks, particularly if we were Hebrew readers, that we would be being clued that we are revisiting the Garden of Eden. That the demeanor and activity of Sarah and Abraham at this point in time are exactly like or very similar to the demeanor and the activity of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. For instance, at the end of verse number 2, okay, Sarah says, the Lord hasn't let me have children, but I have Hagar, and perhaps you could have a child with Hagar. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. Genesis 3:17. God said to Adam, because thou hast hearkened unto the voice of thy wife, and eaten of the tree which I commanded thee. So we have that echo. Adam hearkened to Eve, and Abraham hearkened to Sarah. In Genesis chapter 16 and verse number 3, Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. Genesis 3:6, when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, pleasant to the eyes, tree to be desired, to make one wise, she took the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her. So we are being returned in their logic and in their conduct, not to the same activity, but to the same mentality that we find in the Garden of Eden. In both of these events, folks, the woman was active in leadership and the man was passive in leadership. Now, in our world in 2023, inequality between the genders is one of the great sins of our civilization. And woe to anybody, public figure or corporation, that would be accused of denying a woman equal rights and equal authority. But folks, it just doesn't work that way with the Lord. It just doesn't. And part of the failure here was the failure of mature male leadership. He shouldn't have listened to the voice of his wife, but he did. Adam shouldn't have listened to the voice of his wife. I think we all understand, gentlemen, this doesn't become carte blanche. I don't have to listen to my wife. But women shouldn't run the home. Women shouldn't run the home. Hagar then goes on to become the surrogate for Sarah. You'll notice, folks, and this is true throughout the entirety of the story, that Hagar's feelings and opinions and desires have almost no bearing upon the story. Nobody ever says to Hagar, "What do you think about this?" Hagar, how do you feel about this? She was simply the servant girl. She was owned by Abram and Sarah. She was under their authority. And she is a passive, if unwilling, it's hard to imagine that she is thrilled about this, but she is a passive participant. And one of the things, folks, that we want to understand, or that we should understand as part of contributing to the story, is that what they are doing is completely legal and logical in their civilization. We know that Abram came from Ur of the Chaldees. We know that he was part of the great civilization of Sumer. And part of the way that Sumer operated was it made legal provisions for this kind of surrogacy. So however we might feel about it or think about it, right, there is a culturally acceptable, totally legal dimension to it that they are pursuing. That doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it right to the Lord. But it is not conduct in the face of the norms of their society and their culture. In verse number 4, when this young woman conceived, when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. when she realized that she was going to have a baby and Sarah wasn't, the tables turned. And from that moment on, it appears, Hagar kind of lorded it over Sarah. Now, we don't know exactly how she behaved herself, but I think, folks, that we can imagine that she took every opportunity to point out to Sarah that she was pregnant and Sarah was not, and that she was carrying Abraham's child and Sarah was not. And we know that the relationship becomes very tense because in verse number 5, Sarah turns this back onto Abram. My wrong be upon thee. Right? I have given my maid into thy bosom. When she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judged between me and thee. Now what? Now where are we, husband? This is just a curious note. I mean, it has nothing really to do with the Bible story. It's just a curious note. In verse number 5, the word wrong, the Hebrew word wrong, is the word Hamas. Hamas. We've all heard of Hamas. The Arabic word Hamas means zeal or zealous. But the Hebrew word Hamas means wrong or wronged. And some moderns speculate that one of the reasons the Ishmaelites, the Muslims, chose the word Hamas is because of the way that they could use it to poke Israelites in the eye. They knew that it would upset them, that they were zealous because Israel had wronged them. Like I said, nothing to do with the Bible story. Just I thought an interesting little note. And so in verse number 6, to round out the folly of Abraham and Sarah's context, rather than take any kind of responsibility or leadership role, he just dumps the matter back in Sarah's lap. She's your handmaid, you deal with it. And so Sarah deals then harshly with her. Harshly enough that Hagar decides to leave, and she begins to run away. So again, the first 6 verses, folks, point out to us the folly of men. And we want to make sure that we understand this. The folly of men included doing things that were completely legal and totally logical. They weren't breaking a law. They weren't violating a cultural norm. They were looking at a problem that was a very real problem. I'm 77 years old. I don't have a child. We have a promise. Here's a way that we can accomplish the fulfillment of the promise. And folks, we just really need to be very careful about allowing our human logic to override Bible verses. To look at something in the Bible and go, I know that that's what God says, but there are all of these factors over here. Or here is a way to get it accomplished. So they came up with a legal and logical solution that, again, ended up causing them all kinds of pain and turmoil. I mean, if we just back away from the large, we'll get to this. This will be one of the passages we deal with before we leave Abram. But, right, it's not that Ishmael becomes a thorn in Abram's flesh. Ishmael becomes a grief to Abraham. He is his son and he loves him, and he is now required to deal with him a certain way because he is not the child of promise. So without all the big, large, theological composite pieces of Ishmael's life, the sin of Abraham and Sarah bring personal pain and complication to their own existence. And that brings us then to the second part of the story, verses 7 through 16, which are the faithfulness of God. What is God now going to do? What is God now going to do that Abraham and Sarah have attempted to deal with their barrenness by coming up with a surrogate? Verse number 7, the angel of the Lord found her by a fountain of water in the wilderness, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, whence camest thou? And whither wilt thou go? And she said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, return to thy mistress, and submit thyself under her hands. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. And he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well was called Bir Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. So following the folly of men, we turn our attention to the faithfulness of God. And God just happens, of course, to find her. That's the way the text reads. Not that it was a difficult search for him. But she is headed back to Egypt. Shur, S-H-U-R there, Shur is the first place that Israel camped after God delivered them from the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 15 and verse number 22. And the angel of the Lord appears unto her. And there are times, folks, when the angel of the Lord seems to be a representative of the Lord. And of course, there's a lot of speculation as to whether it would sometimes be the representation of Jesus Christ, the angel of the Lord. In this instance, the angel of the Lord is in some way God himself. And we would assume that from the way that he speaks. Rather than speaking of the Lord kind of in the third person, he speaks in the first person. Verse number 10, the angel of the Lord said, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly. So here's a place, folks, where God himself makes a personal appearance. God appears in visible form to Hagar as she is heading back to Egypt. Again, right? God has made a promise to Abraham. And in Genesis chapter 17, God intends to keep that promise in the way that he had intended it to be. And now we have this baby on the way. I mean, you know, folks, one of the things that the Lord could have done was just take the baby. He could have just said, this child. He took David's baby. He could have just said, we've got to put an end to this right now, and I'm just going to take the baby. Or the Lord could have ignored the baby. I mean, the Lord could have just simply said, you made the baby, your child, your problem. I have nothing to do with this baby. But that is not what the Lord does. And again, we are amazed and perplexed and thoughtful about the way God operates in accomplishing his purposes. So what the Lord does, first of all, he converses with her in verse number 8. Where'd you come from? Of course, he knows. I ran away from Sarah. Where are you going? Well, we've got that figured out. She's on her way back to Egypt. And again, in verse number 9, folks, without any kind of a conversation with Hagar about what she might like to do, Hagar, tell me, what would you like to have happen now? Or what do you think we should do? Or what can I do for you? You've been wronged. You've been mistreated. How can I make this right? There is none of that. Instead, Jehovah God says to her, go back. Go back and place yourself under her authority. Put yourself under her thumb. Verse number 9, the angel of the Lord said unto her, return to thy mistress and submit thyself under her hands. This is what Hagar is to do. This is the instruction that is given to her. And then in verse number 10, in verse number 10, and verse number 11, the Lord begins to talk to her about what kind of child she will have. The angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. So the same kind of promise that was made to Abraham about his seed is extended to Ishmael about his seed. Verse number 11, the angel of the Lord said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son. And thou shalt call his name Ishmael, which means the Lord hears, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. So God is, right, and we know this, folks, God is not oblivious to everything that has happened to this point. He is seen into the hearts of Abraham and Sarah, listened to their conversations, observed their behavior, watched Sarah mistreat Hagar, been attentive to all this. And now, to some extent after the fact, God comes in and begins to act, which again is really rather typical that God allows us to have our way oftentimes, and then he appears to get involved on the consequence side of things. So what kind of man will he be? Verse number 12. He will be a wild man. And there's some debate about whether this is a criticism or not. I tend to think that it is. The word that is used there, wild, is actually used 9 other times in the Old Testament. The difference is in your King James Bible, in every one of those 9 instances, it is always translated wild ass or wild donkey. And that's one of the reasons that there's some debate as to whether Ishmael is being complimented or criticized. Because if you really wanted to criticize somebody in that world, you called them a dog. That was about the greatest insult you could come up with, was to call somebody a dog. To be called a wild donkey was not necessarily a criticism, but just might simply be a commendation of your independent spirit. But I think overall within the framework of the text, I don't think that he is being praised for being that kind of young man. he is going to be a man that is not under control. What kind of man is Ishmael going to be? He's going to be an uncontrollable man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. Which again, I think is one of the reasons that we shouldn't find a compliment in wild man. His uncontrollable nature will cause him to be often at war with others and have others often at war with him. Now we want to make sure that we understand something, folks. Ishmael is not a Muslim. We are many centuries away from the institution of Islam as a religion and the worship of Muhammad. But the connection is that Islam had its birthplace among Ishmaelite people, people of the Arabian Peninsula. So that Ishmaelites today tend to be, in large measure, Islamic people. Back in the early days of America, when we were dealing with the Barbary Coast pirates, we were simply dealing with an early form of Islamic terrorism. President John Adams said, "We will either fight them never or fight them always." It will be one or the other. So he will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him. And he shall dwell in the presence of all his brothers. They will be congregated in concentration, literally in each other's face. So here's where we find ourselves. As a consequence of Abraham and Sarah's action, we have a man who, on the one hand, God promises will be multiplied as the stars of heaven, and God predicts will be a wild, uncontrollable race of people. And if you were to go to the Middle East, or if you've been in the Middle East, you know that they live that tension every day. They live that tension every day. And they know what they are. They refer to themselves accurately. We're cousins. We're cousins with the Jews. That's what they will tell you over there. We're cousins. In verse number 13 then, in verse number 14, Hagar, interestingly enough, Hagar responds to this in faith. Hagar doesn't rebel at either the instruction or the prediction of the Lord. But she does what she is told. And she designates God, verse number 13. She called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou God seest me. You, God, saw me. Now, whether or not this is a testimony of faith, of saving faith, I don't know that we know enough to declare. And she named the well, that was where God found her, by a well of water, the well of the living one who sees me, Bir Lahairoi. The well of the living one who sees me. And she obeys the Lord. Verse number 15. Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. So that what we have, folks, is, without telling us in so many words, she goes back to Abram and Sarah. She submits to Sarah. She obviously informs them of this conversation. And Abram responds by naming the child Ishmael, as God had said. I want you to call him Ishmael. Okay, we'll call him Ishmael. And then we have this note in verse number 16 that Abram is 84 years old. I'm sorry, 86 years old. 86, not 4. 86. So he's an 86-year-old man when all this happens. Right, so here's the faithfulness of God in several ways, right? He has really no obligation to Hagar. His covenant is with Abraham. Abraham has in some ways betrayed the covenant promise by his relationship with Hagar. But neither does God transfer all of the covenant provisions to Ishmael. Ishmael is not the son of promise. And this is how God is going to use this to develop the major theme of salvation by faith versus salvation by works in the Bible. He extends some of the promise of a great seed, but none of the promise of the land. And you know, folks, that they're fighting over the land, and the Ishmaelites lay claim to the land because of their relationship with Abraham. But God is very clear that the promise is that they will be a great nation, but not that they will get the land that he had promised to Abraham. Turn then finally to Galatians chapter 4. The time will come, and we haven't got to that yet, but I'm going to have us read Galatians chapter 4 right now. The time will come when God will insist that Ishmael must go, and God will give instruction that Ishmael has to leave. But for now, Ishmael is to be born to Abraham and Sarah, and he is to grow up in that household. How does the Lord use this, right? We're familiar with this. How does the Lord use this incident, and why is it so significant for us? Galatians chapter 4, verse number 21. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do ye not hear the law? And folks, there is always the temptation on the part of God's people to go back to the law. There's just always that temptation to go back. Tell me, ye that desire to be under the law, do you not hear the law? For it is written that Abraham had two sons, the one by a bondmaid, the other by a free woman. But he who was of the bondwoman was born after the flesh, but he of the free woman was by the promise, which things are an allegory, in that the people and the parties involved, folks, are invested with their own spiritual meaning and significance. Which things are an allegory, for these are the two covenants. The one from the Mount Sinai, which gendereth to bondage, which is Hagar. I'm going to bring the Old Testament reading into the New Testament there, which is Hagar. King James Bible says Hagar. Right, so here's Ishmael, and how do we describe him? Well, he's a child of the flesh. Well, Isaac is a fleshly child, but he's not a child of the flesh. He is born out of the promise. But Ishmael is born not simply as a fleshly child, but out of the thinking of the flesh. And he's born to a bondwoman. And that's what the law is. The law is a bondage. And folks, the New Testament makes that argument in numerous places. Not too far down the road, we will read, Jesus, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. We have a tendency in the 21st century to read and hear that verse as if it is an emotional appeal. Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden. But I would make the argument, and we'll make the argument when we get to it, folks, that it is an appeal to people who are laboring under the bondage of trying to please God by the observation of the law, who are laboring under the weight of the Mosaic covenant to maintain their relationship with the Lord. This heavy weight that laid upon those people. Verse number 25, for this Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia, and answereth to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is superior to Sinai, which now is and is in bondage with her children. But Jerusalem, which is above, is free, which is the mother of us all, for it is written, rejoice, thou barren that bearest not, break forth and cry, thou that travailest not. For the desolate hath many more children than she which hath an husband. Now we, brethren, as Isaac was, are the children of promise. But as then he that was born after the flesh persecuted him that was born after the Spirit, even so it is now. And we will look at that, right? Ishmael will mock Isaac, and upon that God will say he must leave. He has to go. Nevertheless, what saith the Scripture? Cast out the bondwoman, verse number 30, and her son, for the son of the bondwoman shall not be heir with the son of the free woman. So then, brethren, we are not children of the bondwoman, but of the free. Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. And then he takes them right back to what for the Jew was always the critical burning issue. And you got to get circumcised. And you got to get circumcised. And Paul goes, if you go there, right, you got nothing from Christ. You got nothing from Christ. That to go back to the law is to obligate you to the entirety of the law. That's Paul's point. So this is the way the Lord uses this illicit relationship, this relationship that was logical and legal, but was not out of faith. And here we are to this day. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and we will be back at 11 o'clock.